We had planned it for months, the kind of New Year's Eve gathering that would be talked about for years. A group of us, old friends from school, people I'd known for ages, meeting at Matt's house. He'd moved into this big, old place out on the outskirts of town. The kind of house that looks like it should be in a horror movie, but in the best way possible. It had this perfect, almost haunted charm, with high ceilings, creaky floors, and rooms that felt like they belonged to someone else. A proper place to ring in the new year, away from the chaos of the city. The night started off just like we'd expected. The living room was filled with laughter and chatter. Music blared from the speakers, glasses clinked, and everyone was celebrating. I'd had a few drinks, and the alcohol made everything feel lighter, the conversation more relaxed. We all crowded together as the clock neared midnight, counting down with a sort of giddy anticipation. At the moment the clock struck 12, everyone screamed in excitement, clinking our glasses and exchanging hugs. But then, just as quickly, the music stopped. The lights flickered and then went out completely. There was a split second of complete silence, absolute darkness. I could hear people shuffling, some of them swearing. Then someone screamed. It took a few seconds for me to realize the silence wasn't just from the power cut. There was no hum of the fridge, no distant clink of glass, nothing, just the sound of people panicking, the shuffle of feet in the dark. Someone cursed, then another voice called out, but it didn't sound quite right. The room felt too still, too thick with fear. I felt around for my phone, but it had gone dead too. No battery, nothing. There were several gasps around the room, and I heard the frantic scramble as people tried to find the candles we'd set aside, or at least the matches. But it was Matt who finally found the flashlight. He fumbled with it, but the beam shot to life, casting long shadows on the walls. I could hear people talking in panicked whispers, but as Matt swung the beam of light across the room, I realized something was wrong. Half of the people who had been with us just moments before were gone, completely gone. I blinked, thinking I must have missed them, but there was no sign of them, no empty seats, no shadows in the corners, just a strange, unsettling emptiness where they'd been. I froze. There were 10 of us at the party before midnight. Now there were only 5. Matt's hand shook as he swept the flashlight over the room, his breath coming in shallow gasps. We called out names, our voices getting louder, more desperate. We couldn't find anyone. It wasn't possible. Where could they have gone in the span of a few seconds? We checked the other rooms, the bathrooms, even the backyard. I don't know why, but no one seemed to think of calling the police at first. Maybe we were all in shock, still thinking it was some kind of prank. Maybe we thought they were hiding, just messing with us. But when we started calling their phones and got nothing, just the endless ring followed by voicemail, I knew it wasn't a joke anymore. Matt called the police, his voice shaking as he explained what had happened. They didn't take long to arrive, but when they got there, they couldn't find anything either. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anything happening at all. The house was completely locked up. There were no missing items, no bags, no wallets, no phones. The officers searched the grounds, the woods behind the house, but came up with nothing. No signs of a struggle, no footprints in the snow, no blood, just the absence of 6 people. After a few hours, the police left. There was nothing they could do. I remember looking at the place, the house that had felt so full of life only hours before, and realizing how eerily silent it had become. The next day, and the days after that, everything was just as bizarre. No one had seen any of them. Their phones remained dead, and none of their families had heard anything. No trace of them anywhere. It didn't make sense, and the police couldn't figure it out. It didn't stop them from trying. Interviews, neighborhood searches, even checking nearby CCTV footage. But there was nothing. They hadn't left the house. They hadn't gone anywhere. The authorities said it was like they'd vanished into thin air. Months went by, and still no answers. They were just gone. We never heard from them again. I shouldn't have gone to that party. That much I knew as soon as the alcohol started to wear off, and I was standing in front of a house that I thought belonged to my friend. The lights were on inside. The front door cracked open like someone was expecting me. I wasn't sure how I'd gotten here or how long I'd been walking. The night had turned into a blur after a few too many shots and beers. But when I saw the house, I thought, this is it. This is where I'm supposed to be. I pushed the door open without thinking and stumbled inside. It felt a bit strange, but then again it was late and I was drunk. I couldn't remember if my friend lived in a place like this, but it didn't matter. The warmth from the house hit me like a wave. and I just wanted to sit down, take my shoes off, maybe fall asleep on the couch. I didn't think anything of it until I saw the family. They were sitting around the table, eating dinner, their faces frozen in shock. The father was the first to stand up, his chair scraping against the floor. The mother, a woman with dark hair and tired eyes, just stared at me, wide-eyed, her fork hanging halfway to her mouth. A little girl, no more than 5, sat in the corner, clutching a stuffed animal to her chest, her eyes wide and round. I tried to apologize, but the words wouldn't come out right. Everything felt like it was spinning. They didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me as I stood there trying to make sense of what was going on. I muttered something about how I was looking for my friend, but it felt wrong, like the words didn't fit together. The dad took a step forward, eyes narrowing, his body tense. That's when I realized it. This wasn't my friend's house. I stepped back, one hand reaching for the door, but the father was already moving towards me. His voice was calm, too calm, but there was something beneath it. Something cold. I didn't know what I'd done, but I knew it was bad. They didn't seem like they were just surprised by my drunken intrusion. They were angry. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The mother had come up behind me, and now the father was right in front of me, blocking the way. I tried to explain again, but my words slurred together, and it only seemed to make him angrier. His eyes were fixed on me, and I could feel the heat of his glare on my face. I could smell the food, the stale air of the house, and the sweat starting to form at the back of my neck. I tried to push past him, but he was too quick. The father grabbed my arm with surprising strength and yanked me back, his grip like iron. I don't remember how it started, but suddenly I was struggling with him, pushing and shoving, my head spinning from the alcohol and fear. I heard the sound of a chair scraping, the mother screaming for him to stop, and the little girl crying, but none of it seemed real. It was like I was watching everything happen from a distance, like I wasn't even there. My feet slid across the wooden floor, and I felt myself losing balance. The father was shouting something, but I couldn't make it out. All I knew was that I had to get out. I couldn't fight him, not like this. I wasn't strong enough. My vision blurred, and I saw the mother step forward, her hand reaching for something on the table. It was a knife, a big, shiny knife. I didn't see the point in trying to talk anymore. I needed to get away. I shoved the father as hard as I could, using all my weight, and broke free for a second. I stumbled towards the door, but it was too late. The mother lunged at me, the knife flashing in the dim light, and I barely dodged it. I felt the cold metal scrape across my arm, and a searing pain shot through me. I could taste blood in my mouth. I tried to run, but my legs were unsteady, and the pain in my arm made everything harder. The father was behind me again, and I could hear his footsteps closing in. The door was just ahead, but it felt like it was miles away. I had to make it. I had to get out. But I didn't make it. I felt the father's hands on my back, and before I could react, he shoved me forward. I hit the floor hard, my head slamming into the wooden boards. Everything went dark for a moment. When I came to, I could hear the muffled voices of the family, but I couldn't move. I could taste dirt in the air, and I felt like I was sinking into something. I tried to raise my head, but my body wouldn't obey. The father's voice was in my ear, low and angry. I couldn't understand him. I wanted to scream, to beg, but the words wouldn't come. My vision blurred again, and I felt something cold against my skin. I wasn't sure if it was the snow or something else, but I knew I was on the ground, and I couldn't get up. I heard footsteps retreating, the sound of the door opening, and then silence. I don't know how long I lay there. I don't know if they're still out there, or if anyone will come for me. All I know is that I can't move, and I'm alone. The darkness is closing in, and I don't know if I'll make it out of here. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, a quiet place to get away from work and clear our heads after the chaos of the year. My co-workers and I had all agreed on it. A luxury cabin in the mountains, remote, secluded, with no distractions, just the way we liked it. The idea was to escape the noise, the deadlines, and the endless emails. But things didn't go the way we planned. We arrived on New Year's Eve, just as the sun was setting. The drive up the mountain was long and winding, the kind of road where you can feel the emptiness pressing in around you. The cabin itself was bigger than I'd expected, with big windows that looked out over nothing but trees and snow-covered slopes. It looked like something from a magazine, all wood and glass, with a roaring fire in the hearth. We unpacked quickly, eager to settle in, but by the time we'd finished, the snow had started falling heavily. It was just a dusting, but within hours it turned into something worse. The wind picked up and the snow started to come down in sheets, thick and heavy. By midnight, the world outside had turned into a blur of white. The wind howled, and the cabin creaked, its wooden beams groaning under the weight of the storm. The power flickered a few times, but it didn't go out completely, not yet. We gathered around the fire and drank to the new year. No one was talking about anything serious. Just small talk, the kind you make when you're with people you work with but don't really know all that well. We laughed, told a few stories, and tried to ignore the storm outside. It felt like we were in our own little world, cut off from everything else. But as the hours went by, something started to feel off. I'm not sure when it began. Maybe it was when we realized the storm wasn't letting up, or when the power went out for good. No one was concerned at first. We had candles and firelight. It was still warm inside, the cold of the storm kept outside by the thick walls. But when we tried to check our phones, the signal was gone. Nothing, no reception. That's when we started to feel trapped. By morning, the snow was so thick outside that we couldn't even see the road. It was like we were in a snow globe, the world frozen around us. We had no choice but to stay inside and wait it out, hoping the storm would let up. But by noon, one of us, Rob, had gone missing. No one noticed at first. We thought he'd gone out for a walk, maybe trying to stretch his legs in the snow. It wasn't until we looked outside and saw his footprints in the snow that we realized something was wrong. The tracks led away from the cabin, then just stopped, no sign of him. We called his name, but there was nothing. The storm was still raging, and it was hard to hear over the wind, but we all felt it, the quiet creeping in around us. We searched the area, but there was no trace of him, not a single sign that he'd been there. His footprints just ended, as if he'd vanished into thin air. Panic started to set in then. The idea of someone just disappearing like that was too much to ignore. We'd all seen those news stories, heard the whispers about strange disappearances in remote places, but this was real. The tension that followed was impossible to shake. The air inside the cabin felt thick, charged with something we couldn't put our fingers on. We ate in silence, eyes flicking nervously around the room. We weren't sure who to trust, not anymore. Some of us had already begun to suspect that Rob might have just run off. But something about the way his tracks disappeared felt wrong, like he hadn't walked away but had been taken. As the hours wore on, we began to argue. It wasn't about anything specific, but the strain of being stuck together, the uncertainty of what had happened to Rob. It wore on us. Everyone was on edge. Everyone was looking over their shoulder. What if one of us was next? What if this wasn't just an accident? By the time night fell again, we were all too scared to sleep. We huddled together by the fire, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin. We took turns keeping watch, not wanting to be the one left alone. But the storm never stopped. It only got worse. The wind howled, the snow piled higher against the windows, and still there was no sign of Rob. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard something. It was faint at first, just a whisper against the wind. But then it grew louder, more distinct, a muffled voice calling out. It was coming from outside. We all heard it. It was impossible not to. A voice calling from the snow, desperate and faint, like someone was out there, lost in the storm. We rushed to the window, but we couldn't see anything. The snow was coming down in sheets, and the world outside was a swirling mass of white. We called out, but the voice didn't reply. It just kept calling, muffled and faint, like it was trapped under the weight of the storm, and then it stopped. Just like that. Gone. We waited. We listened, but there was nothing. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen in place. The storm was still raging, but it felt like the world outside had gone completely still, like we were waiting for something. Or someone. I never saw Rob again. We never found him. The storm didn't let up for days, and when it finally cleared, we left the cabin. No one spoke of what happened after that. We all just went back to our lives, pretending that it had never happened, that Rob had just disappeared. But every now and then, I still hear that voice in my head. And sometimes I wonder if Rob really disappeared at all, or if something else was out there in the snow with us. I wasn't supposed to be alone on New Year's Eve. That wasn't the plan. But there I was, sitting in a dimly lit room of a rundown hotel on the edge of town, nursing a bottle of cheap whiskey and nursing the mess I'd made of things with Claire. We'd had an argument, a stupid one, really, about nothing and everything. I hadn't meant to hurt her, but I did. And now I was here, stuck in a crappy hotel with peeling wallpaper and a bed that creaked every time you moved. Not exactly the kind of place you want to be when the whole world is out celebrating. I couldn't even hear the fireworks, just the hum of the old radiator and the occasional car passing on the road outside. It was one of those places that felt like it had been forgotten by time, and the more I sat there, the more the silence pressed in on me. I looked at the clock. 11:55 p.m. It was almost midnight, and I couldn't help but think about Claire. I should have called, should have apologized, but I didn't. Instead, I drank. Then, just as the minute hand ticked past midnight, I heard it. A scream. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A sharp, high-pitched cry, muffled by the walls. My stomach tightened, and for a moment I thought it might have been someone else in the hotel, a couple fighting or something. But then it came again, louder this time. A scream so full of fear that it made my skin prickle. I grabbed my phone, but when I tried to call the front desk, there was no answer. I dialed again, still nothing. My mind raced. What if someone was in trouble? What if they needed help? But then, just as I was about to get up and go down to the desk myself, the scream echoed again, so close I could almost feel it. I decided to call. The voice on the other end was flat, almost bored. I told them I'd heard screams coming from the room next door, and they said the room was empty. No one had checked in there, they insisted. I could feel my pulse quicken as I argued with them, but they didn't budge. The woman on the phone sounded like she couldn't care less, as if this sort of thing happened all the time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. So I went to investigate. I stood outside the door of the room next to mine, the door to room 16, my hand hovering over the knob. The faintest sound of shuffling came from behind the door, followed by another scream, quieter this time, like someone was trying to suppress it. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. The scream stopped abruptly, and I heard nothing. I waited, breath fogging the cold air, listening. But then it came again, a scream, desperate and raw. I didn't think. I just acted. I couldn't sit there any longer. I couldn't listen to that sound, to someone in pain, and do nothing. My hand reached for the door handle, and with one quick motion, I shoved the door open. It wasn't much of a door, old wood with cheap locks, and it gave way easily under the pressure. I stepped inside, heart hammering in my chest, expecting to find someone, anyone, in trouble. But the room was empty. The bed was made, the light from the hallway spilling in through the crack in the door. But there was no one there, no sign of anyone at all. I stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, blinking, trying to process what I was seeing. There was nothing, just the stale, musty air and the quiet. Not even a hint of the screams that had filled my head moments before. I didn't know what to think. I still don't. I left the door wide open as I backed out, looking around the room one last time. But it didn't make sense. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate that someone had been there at all. The hallway outside was just as empty, the hotel as silent as it had been when I first arrived. I went back to my room, locking the door behind me, and sat on the bed, trying to calm my breathing. My phone was still dead. The front desk never called back. The clock ticked past 1 a.m., then 2, and still there was no sign of anyone else, no explanation for what had happened. I didn't sleep that night, not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the scream. It didn't make sense. It was like it was echoing in my mind over and over again, but no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, I knew what I'd heard, and I knew somehow that the room next door hadn't been empty. When I checked out in the morning, the receptionist barely glanced at me. The same bored look, the same indifferent voice. I never found out who was in that room or why the screams stopped the moment I opened the door. But I'm still not sure I want to know. We were a close group of friends, the kind who'd known each other for years, long enough to forget how we met or why we'd become so tight. It was a New Year's Eve like any other, but this time we had decided to make resolutions, not just the usual lose weight or drink less, but something a bit more personal. We made a pact, nothing too formal, but it felt important that we'd bury our past mistakes and move forward, start fresh. The conversation started out light, but as the drinks flowed and the clock ticked toward midnight, the mood shifted. We were all aware of the weight we carried, of things that had happened in the past that had been left unsaid, swept under the rug for too long. There was one thing none of us could forget, though. Something that had happened years ago, something we'd promised we'd never speak of again. But that night, with the promise of a new beginning hanging in the air, I could tell everyone was thinking about it. I don't know why I did it. I suppose I just wanted to believe we could put it all behind us. I was one of the first to raise my glass, and as I did, I could see the unease in the others' eyes. But we all drank, toasted to new beginnings, to fresh starts, to forgiveness. The next morning the sun was bright, too bright for my liking, and the hangover I had wasn't nearly as bad as I expected. We gathered at the old cabin, the same place we always went to for New Year's Day, somewhere out of the way, away from the rest of the world. It was perfect for that kind of quiet reflection. No phones, no distractions, just the five of us. We laughed, talked about our plans for the year ahead, but underneath it all there was a tension, a feeling that something wasn't right. No one said anything, but we all felt it. It wasn't until the afternoon that things started to go wrong. We were out in the woods, a short walk from the cabin, when Mark disappeared. We hadn't noticed at first, not really. He'd wandered off ahead, as he often did when he was drunk, but when we called out for him, he didn't answer. We searched for hours, calling his name, walking deeper into the woods, hoping to find him stumbling out of the trees with a sheepish grin on his face. But he didn't. We were starting to get worried when we came across it. It was just a tree, one of those tall, crooked things with bark so dark it looked almost black. But when we looked closer, something caught our eye. A message carved into the bark. It was hard to make out at first, the letters jagged, uneven, like someone had used a dull knife, but the meaning was clear enough. Some promises can't be broken. We froze. The air in the woods seemed to go still, too still. I could hear my heart beating in my chest, and I could see the others looking around, as if waiting for something, for someone to appear. But there was nothing. No Mark, no sign of him at all. We went back to the cabin, frantic now, and called the police. But by the time they arrived, it was as if Mark had never been there. The woods had swallowed him whole. There were no tracks, no sign of him anywhere. They searched for hours, called in more people, but it was all for nothing. No one could find a thing. They said we must have imagined it, that maybe he had just wandered off or gotten lost, but I knew better. That carving, those words, they were a reminder of something we'd all tried to forget, something we'd promised not to think about, but which had somehow followed us. We couldn't break that promise, not really, not even when we thought we had. We couldn't escape it, and neither could Mark. The police left after a few days, but we didn't. We stayed at the cabin, unsure of what to do, where to go, until the bitter cold of winter drove us back to our lives. Mark's family never heard from him again. There were no sightings, no new leads, just a few weeks of quiet before they gave up searching. I haven't heard from the others since. I don't know if they've kept in touch with each other, but I haven't spoken to any of them. It's been years now, but the woods are still there. And I still remember that carving, the words that were never meant for us, but that we had all tried to ignore. I wonder if any of us can truly escape what we've done. I wonder if Mark knew something we didn't, if he was the first one to realize that some things can't stay buried. It was a quiet New Year's Eve, just me and Lucy. We'd planned it that way, nothing fancy, no big parties, no fireworks, just a cozy night in. I put on some soft music, made a little dinner, and after we'd eaten, I tucked her into bed, kissed her forehead, and told her to get some rest. I figured I'd just watch the clock tick over to midnight and then call it a night myself. I sat on the couch, flipping through the channels. The house was peaceful, quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house settled. I wasn't one for New Year's celebrations. I'd long since stopped going out for the big night, not with Lucy to take care of, and besides, I wasn't much for the whole thing. Just me, the ticking of the clock, and the warmth of the room. At exactly midnight, I heard the knock. It was sharp, quick, and unexpected. I looked at the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking over to 12 o'clock. Then I heard it again. 3 knocks, one after the other. I stood up from the couch, confused. At this hour, I wasn't expecting anyone. I made my way to the door, peering through the peephole. There was a man standing there, hunched a bit, with his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket. His face was half in shadow, but I could see enough to make out that he looked disheveled, like he'd been through something. I opened the door a crack, just enough to speak to him. He told me he'd been in an accident, that his car had broken down somewhere on the road and he needed help. His voice was shaky, urgent. I felt a bit of that protective instinct kick in. I couldn't just leave someone out in the cold, not on New Year's Eve, but something about him felt off. He was standing too still, his eyes darting around, as if he wasn't quite focusing on me, like he was looking for something behind me. I told him I wasn't sure I could help, that I didn't have a phone to call anyone, and maybe he should wait until morning when things were more settled. But he didn't move. Instead, he pressed a little closer to the door, his breath misting in the cold night air. "I just need to come in," he said, his voice now sounding almost desperate, "just for a moment to warm up. It's freezing out here." "You wouldn't want me to freeze, would you?" There was a pause. I hesitated. He didn't sound right. The more he spoke, the more his story shifted. He said his car had crashed into a tree, then later said he'd run out of petrol, then again changed his story, saying he'd been mugged. Every time he spoke, the details didn't quite add up. His voice was higher now, a little frantic. I could hear him breathing, a sharp intake of air between every word. I didn't want to let him in. Something about him felt wrong, like a string of lies just beneath the surface, ready to unravel. I glanced back at the hallway where Lucy was sleeping. She was safe, tucked in tight, but I still didn't feel right standing there alone with this stranger at my door. He knocked again, harder this time, as if his patience had worn thin. "Please," he said, "I just need to get in for a minute. You've got to let me in. I'm not going to hurt you," but he was already moving closer, as if he meant to push past me. My heart started to pound. My hands shook slightly as I held the door just enough to block him. His eyes were wide now, and his movements were jerky, as if he was losing control of himself. I slammed the door shut, locking it with the bolt. I backed away, breathing fast, my mind racing. What should I do? Was he really hurt? Was there someone else with him? I stood still, listening. For a moment there was silence, just the sound of the house settling, the faint hum of the heating system in the background. But then I heard the knock again, this time more frantic, followed by a voice muffled through the door. "Please," he begged. "Please let me in. I'm freezing. I'm lost. You have to help me." I didn't move. I didn't open the door. I just stood there, listening. He didn't leave. The knocking continued, insistent, almost rhythmic, as if he were waiting for something, waiting for me to crack. I called the police, and they said they'd send someone right away. But when they got there, they didn't find anything. No one on the porch, no sign of the man. The street was empty. They checked the area, asked if I was sure I'd seen anyone, but the whole thing didn't make sense. The man never came back. But I can't stop thinking about him, about the way his voice changed, the way he kept trying to get inside. There's something about it that lingers with me, something that doesn't feel like it's over. I keep thinking I'll hear another knock at the door, or I'll find his shadow outside the window. But no one ever comes. Not yet. I had only just arrived at the party, stepping into the glittering high-rise apartment that overlooked the city skyline. The New Year's Eve celebrations were already in full swing, with glasses clinking, laughter echoing, and music pulsing through the speakers. It was the kind of event you'd expect, lavish, extravagant, the kind of thing you'd see in magazines. A long table covered in food, people in cocktail dresses and sharp suits. A crowd of well-dressed strangers mingling under a soft glow of expensive lighting. I didn't know many people there, but I recognized a few familiar faces. A colleague, a couple of friends from uni, all scattered around in clusters, talking, laughing and toasting to the year ahead. It felt normal, until I started noticing the people who weren't there. As the night went on, I realized I hadn't seen a few of the guests I had been introduced to earlier. At first I thought it was nothing. People move around, get lost in conversation, slip away to the kitchen or the balcony. But then I started to notice how empty the apartment was in some places. A few corners where no one stood. A couple of rooms that felt eerily silent, even though I could hear voices from the others. I brushed it off as a quirk of the space. The flat was large, with sweeping views of the city and a maze of rooms that all led somewhere else. But it wasn't until the countdown to midnight began that I saw him. He was across the room, standing by the windows alone. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't dressed like anyone else at the party. His clothes were simple, dark, not at all flashy like the others. He stood still, watching me. His gaze felt heavy, too intense. I turned away quickly, pretending to focus on the others who were counting down, but I could feel his eyes on me. The lights dimmed for the countdown. Cheers filled the room as everyone shouted the numbers, and I joined in, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. There was something wrong, something about the way he watched me. Then, as the clock struck midnight, the power cut out. The whole apartment plunged into darkness. For a split second, there was complete silence. The kind of silence you feel in your chest, like everyone is holding their breath. Then, chaos. People started shouting, fumbling for their phones to use as torches, bumping into each other in the dark. It wasn't just the lights that were out. The music had stopped. The hum of the fridge and the distant clinking of glasses all ceased at once. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and began to scan the room. Everyone was still there, or so I thought, until I realized that some faces were missing. Some had just vanished. I didn't see the man by the windows anymore. I didn't see a few others either. I could hear the movement of footsteps, the muffled voices, but no one seemed to know where anyone was. Panic spread quickly. People called out names, asking if anyone had seen anyone else. The hallway was silent. The kitchen was empty, the balcony too. A group of guests started to gather in the center of the room, looking lost, unsure. The more I looked around, the more I realized there were fewer and fewer people standing in the light from our phones. And then I saw it. The door to one of the bedrooms was open, just a crack. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it. My heart was pounding, my mind screaming at me not to go, but I couldn't help myself. I walked towards it, the floor creaking under my feet, the phone light shaking in my hand. I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the window was open. A gust of cold air coming through, the curtains fluttering. I didn't remember it being open before. The view outside was dark, the city lights distant and muted in the foggy night. I stepped closer to the window, peering outside. That's when I saw him again, the man. He was standing on the edge of the building, looking out at the city as if he had been there all along. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling. I turned around, ready to head back to the main room. But the door slammed shut behind me. I rushed back to the hallway, calling out for someone, anyone. But there was no answer. The power stayed off. The apartment was silent. The people were vanishing, one by one, and then everything went dark. The night had been everything you'd expect for a New Year's Eve in the city. The music had been loud, the drinks flowed freely, and the crowd was buzzing with that kind of reckless energy you only get on the first night of the year. I didn't have a lot of plans after the countdown, just to get home safely and crawl into bed. My friends had all left, so I ordered a rideshare to take me back to my flat. I was tired, maybe a little too tipsy, but the ride was supposed to be a quick, easy way to put an end to the madness of the night. The app pinged and I saw that a car was only a minute away. I stepped outside the club and into the cold night air, the city lights flickering above me like distant stars. The car pulled up, an unmarked black sedan. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Plenty of ride-share cars looked like that. The door opened and I slid into the back seat, still half focused on my phone. The driver didn't say anything. I glanced at him, saw nothing unusual, just a man in his 30s, wearing a baseball cap, his face half shadowed by the streetlight. I muttered my address and buckled up, sinking into the seat. It wasn't until we started driving that I realized something wasn't right. The streets felt unfamiliar. The usual route home, through the busy part of the city, then out into quieter areas, was gone. Instead, we were winding through narrow, dimly lit roads, some of which didn't even look like proper streets at all, the kind of places you'd expect to find old warehouses or dead ends. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe there was a road closure or some detour I didn't know about, but it didn't take long for the unease to settle in. I pulled up the map on my phone, but the screen had gone dark. I tried to tap it a few times, but nothing happened. A sudden wave of panic washed over me. I turned to look at the driver, but he was focused on the road, his hands gripping the wheel too tightly. His knuckles were white. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "I think you've taken a wrong turn." He didn't answer. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. The streetlights outside were flickering more now, casting strange shadows on the buildings. The further we went, the more isolated the area became. I could see the occasional glimpse of a run-down house or a closed shop, but there was no sign of other cars, no pedestrians, nothing. It was like we were in some forgotten part of the city. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice a little more strained this time. The driver didn't respond. I could feel my heartbeat quicken. My phone was still dead, and I couldn't see a single other car on the road. The silence in the car was suffocating. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just late and I was tired, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wanted to ask him to stop, to let me out, but I didn't want to provoke him. Something about the way he drove, so rigid, so tense, made me hesitate. I looked out of the window again. The road ahead twisted like a dark snake, leading deeper into the unknown. At some point, I stopped trying to understand where we were going. My mind was racing through all the possibilities. Was this a mistake? Was I in danger? I needed to get out of the car, but I couldn't do it just yet. There had to be a way to turn this around, to make sure nothing bad happened. But then the car took a sharp turn, and for the first time I saw a sign. It was so faded, so worn, I almost missed it. It didn't even have a proper street name, just a number and some letters that looked like they'd been spray painted over. I felt sick. I knew this area wasn't right. I sat back, my fingers digging into the fabric of the seat, trying to steady myself. The car slowed as we approached an old crumbling building on the right, what looked like an abandoned factory. There were no lights on, no movement, just the faint sound of the wind against the walls. I could see nothing but the empty dark windows staring back at me. I was panicking now. My breath was coming quicker, my hands shaking. I glanced at the driver once more. He didn't look at me, he didn't look at anything. It was as if he was driving by instinct, like a machine, carrying me somewhere I didn't want to go. I tried the door handle, but it was locked. The car stopped. My heart hammered in my chest as the engine cut out. The silence was absolute. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver shifted in his seat, and I could feel him staring at me through the rearview mirror. His eyes were hidden under the shadow of his cap, but the slight tilt of his head made it clear he was watching. I could see the dim glow of a street lamp a little further down the road. There was still a chance to get out. I didn't know how far I could run, but it was better than sitting here waiting for whatever would happen next. I grabbed the door handle again. Desperate, I yanked it, and this time it opened. I didn't even think. I just bolted, and the cold air hit me all at once, but I didn't stop. And I didn't care about the snow or the darkness. I just needed to put distance between myself and the car. I ran down the street, not looking back, not stopping to catch my breath. But after a while, I couldn't hear the car anymore. I didn't stop until I found a corner shop that was open, the neon lights flickering in the distance. I stumbled in, my hands trembling, and asked the woman behind the counter where I was. She didn't seem surprised, didn't ask any questions. She just gave me a strange look and said, "You shouldn't be out here this time of night." When I looked back out of the window, there was no sign of the car, just the dark streets stretching away into the unknown. I wasn't expecting much when I checked into the hotel. It was one of those cheap places on the edge of town, the kind you end up in when you just need somewhere to stay for the night. I had made the decision to spend New Year's alone, away from all the noise and expectations. I wanted to drink a glass of wine, read a book, and let the year end quietly without all the fuss. The receptionist barely looked at me as she handed over the key. She was an older woman, her face blank and tired, like she'd been working there for too long. The hallway smelled faintly of cleaning products and something else I couldn't quite place, something stale. I tried not to think too much about it as I made my way to my room. I wasn't particularly worried about the state of the room. I'd seen worse, and this wasn't the worst. A sagging bed, peeling wallpaper, the smell of mildew in the corners. It was fine, really, just what I needed for a night on my own. I locked the door behind me, unpacked my things, and settled in. It wasn't until later that the noises started. It was just a faint thud. I thought it might have been the plumbing or something settling in the walls. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by a hurried shuffle of footsteps. I thought it was the person next door. Maybe they were moving around, rearranging furniture. But then there was a scream, muffled but unmistakable. I froze, my hand still on the book I'd been trying to read. The scream wasn't a loud one, but it was there. Sharp, terrified. I strained to listen. Another thud, then silence. My heart was pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or if something real was happening just on the other side of the wall. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed my phone and called the front desk, but the woman's voice was flat and unconcerned when I told her what I'd heard. She said the room next door, 204, was empty. No one was checked in. That didn't make any sense. The noises were too distinct, too close. I could almost picture the person next door, pacing the room, banging against the walls in a frantic hurry. But the receptionist insisted no one was there. She told me not to worry and to get some rest. I hung up, unsure of what to do. The room next door was supposed to be empty, but the noises kept coming. The thuds, the footsteps, the muffled scream that sounded like it was coming from right behind the wall. I tried to ignore it, tried to drown it out with the television, but it didn't work. The sounds grew louder, more urgent. I heard something heavy thud against the floor, then a scraping sound like something being dragged. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I threw on my coat and went to the door. My hand was shaking as I turned the knob, but I forced myself to open it. I stepped into the hallway and looked down at the door to room 204. The door was slightly ajar. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, unsure of what to do. Should I knock? Should I go inside? But just as I was about to move, I heard the door creak open from the inside, just a fraction more, as if someone had seen me standing there. I didn't move. After a long stretch of silence, I finally gathered the courage to knock. I knocked softly, then harder. No response. I stepped back, listening for any movement inside. Nothing. Just the faint hum of the hotel's air conditioning and the silence of the hallway around me. The receptionist had said no one was in there, but something felt wrong. The door was slightly open and I was sure I'd heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps just a few moments ago. I went back to my room, heart pounding, the hallway stretching out behind me like an empty, desolate place. I locked the door behind me and tried to settle back onto the bed, but the sounds from next door continued. Another thud, followed by another scream. I knew I couldn't take it anymore. I called the front desk again, but this time the woman didn't answer. I left a message. Still, the noises didn't stop. The sounds echoed through the thin walls, growing louder, more desperate, until I thought I would lose my mind. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I packed my things quickly, trying not to think about what had happened. When I checked out, I didn't say a word. The receptionist was still there, staring blankly at her screen. I wanted to ask about the room next door, about what I'd heard, but I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to do it. As I left the hotel, I glanced back over my shoulder. The building looked the same as when I'd arrived. Dark, silent, forgotten. I didn't know who or what had been in that room, or if it had been real at all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd heard something awful, something that shouldn't have been there. And when I looked at the hotel again, I saw something strange. The door to room 204 was wide open. We had all agreed on it, New Year's Eve in a remote cabin far away from the city. A place where we could detox from the chaos of our everyday lives and get a fresh start. There were 6 of us, old friends, the kind you'd expect to spend a night like this with. The cabin was isolated, a 2-hour drive into the woods with nothing but snow and trees surrounding it. We were excited to escape, to set resolutions, to relax and enjoy the quiet. The first few hours were exactly what we'd hoped for. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, the kitchen smelled of stew and mulled wine, and we laughed, reminisced, and felt like we had all the time in the world. The snow outside had started to fall heavily, and the world seemed distant and muffled, like we were sealed off from everything. Around 10 o'clock, we settled in to do a little planning for the new year. A few of us sat around the dining table, scribbling down goals, while others lounged in front of the fire, sipping drinks. That's when Sarah said she needed to step outside to make a quick phone call. Her boyfriend had been trying to reach her, and she was starting to get a little worried. She went out through the back door, her figure disappearing into the swirling snow as she made her way to the small clearing at the edge of the woods. We didn't think much of it. She'd only be a few minutes, we figured. But after 20 minutes, she still hadn't come back. At first, we laughed it off. She was probably chatting away or just enjoying the peace outside. But then another half hour passed and the laughter stopped. We started checking our phones. No messages from her, no missed calls. Her phone was still working. We thought she hadn't turned it off. We decided to go out and look for her. It wasn't a big cabin, and the clearing wasn't far from the back door. The snow was deep, but not impossible to walk through. I went with Jack, and a few of the others stayed behind, still talking, though there was an edge of worry in their voices now. We called her name as we walked through the snow, the world around us silent except for the crunch of our boots. The night felt colder somehow, the air sharper than before. The wind had picked up and the snow was falling more thickly. The woods felt endless, the trees looming like dark shapes against the grey sky. We reached the clearing, no sign of Sarah. I started to feel that crawling unease creeping in. The phone call had only been supposed to take a few minutes, and yet here we were, looking around the snow-covered ground, finding nothing but the impression of her footprints. Jack was already looking more panicked. His voice cracked when he said he was going back to the cabin to grab a flashlight. I stayed in the clearing, calling Sarah's name louder, trying to hear any sound, any movement, but the snow muffled everything. The wind carried nothing but silence. Then I heard something, a faint sound, like footsteps in the snow, but not from where I had expected. It came from the edge of the trees, deeper into the woods. I froze, straining my ears to listen. I couldn't make out much, but I was sure it wasn't Jack. I was alone in the clearing now. I shouted again for Sarah, but the only answer was the soft rustling of snow underfoot, as though something or someone was moving just out of sight. Jack came back with the flashlight, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he just pointed at the edge of the woods. The light from the torch shone through the falling snow, and for a brief second I thought I saw a figure standing between the trees. It was still, too still. Before I could react, the figure darted into the darkness. We ran back to the cabin, our hearts pounding. We called out for the others, but there was no answer. We made our way inside, but the door wouldn't open. It was stuck. A gust of wind slammed against the windows, and for a moment I thought I saw someone watching us through the frost-covered glass. We finally forced the door open, and when we stumbled inside, we found the others huddled together, faces white with fear. They'd heard noises too, whispers from the woods, faint footsteps on the porch. Sarah wasn't with them. The storm outside grew worse, the wind howling louder now. We locked every door, checked every window, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore. Something was watching us, waiting. We stayed up for hours, half-heartedly trying to figure out where Sarah had gone, who or what had been in the woods. The phone lines were down. The cabin was silent except for the sound of the storm and our breathing. At some point I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the sound of the door creaking open. The wind had stopped and the room was too quiet. I looked over at the others, but they were still, frozen in place. The door had opened on its own. Then I saw it, footprints in the snow right outside the cabin, leading up to the door, stopping at the threshold. And just beyond the glass in the woods, someone was standing. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their eyes on me. We never found Sarah. The storm passed by morning and the roads were clear, but we couldn't leave. No matter how many times we checked, the tracks were always there, just outside the door.